Hello, y'all. Professor McCurdy here. We are lecturing on Chapter 12, the nervous system in AMP1. Um, the nervous system is one of the most complex systems in the body. You can actually take an entire, full semester course on neurology and, of course, not learn everything because we're still figuring things out about the way the nervous system works. Your book has 6 chapters on the nervous system, starting with Chapter 12. Chapter 12 talks about nervous tissue. It also gets into, some, at least this lecture, we will talk about um, the organization of the nervous system. But then we'll kind of focus on the two components of nervous tissue, which are the neurons and the neuroglia. Then we will talk a lot of detail about how um, neurons work, right? And then we've got several other chapters, one with, the spinal cord and spinal nerves, one about the brain and cranial nerves, one about the autonomic nervous system. Chapter 16 deals with sensory and motor pathways, and chapter 17 talks about special senses. And you may or may not get lectures on chapter 16 depending on the semester and who your instructor is. But I plan to reuse these videos far into the future, so um, you know, check the syllabus whether 16 is covered. All right, so anytime we talk about a new system of the body, we want to talk about what organs and what structures belong to that system of the body. So for the nervous system, you have the brain, right, which it's not the best brain I've ever drawn. Coming off the brain, you have the brain stem, which connects to the spinal cord. Coming off the spinal cord and the brain, you have various nerves, right? So nerves that come off the brain are called cranial nerves, and nerves that come off the spinal cord are called spinal nerves. Much better drawing over here. In addition to the brain and spinal cord, as well as the nerves, you have sensory structures throughout the body, right? In the head, you have eyes, taste buds, the ears, um, and then distributed throughout the body, you have things like Meissner corpuscles and Pacinian corpuscles that we've talked about before, free nerve endings. All of those sensory structures belong to the nervous system. In AMP2, you'll talk about the nervous system and you'll learn more about the enteric nervous system, which includes two uh, enteric plexuses. These are clusters of neuronal cell bodies embedded in the walls of your gastrointestinal tract, primarily the small intestine. These would be the myenteric plexus and submucosal plexus, also known as Meissner's plexus and the plexus of Auerbach, if I'm remembering correctly. A distinction that you'll see, and I'll go into this in a little bit more detail. The central nervous system, which we often just abbreviate the CNS, right? The CNS is the brain and the spinal cord. We'll talk about the significance of the central nervous system at several different points in time. The peripheral nervous system, these are all the nerves, sensory structures. And the various ganglia. We'll talk about what a ganglion is later. Ganglia would be the plural of ganglion. So, what are the functions of the nervous system? So I believe way back in chapter 1, we kind of summarized the function of the nervous system as, a control center, or we said that the nervous system, regulates other systems, a function that the nervous system shares with the endocrine system. Well, we want to expand on that now. Basically, we can break down the functions of the nervous system into sort of three steps, right? So regardless of what your brain or spinal cord is doing, it happens in kind of three phases, uh, or three steps. Or three functions. There is the sensory function, right? Sensory um, would be the detection um, of changes in the environment, and that would be both the internal and external environment. So, you probably learned about the five senses in school at some point, vision, hearing, taste, touch, and smell. Um, Turns out that you have a lot more senses than that. That's uh, a very simplified view. You have something more like 31 sensory modalities, something like that, some of which you're conscious of, some of which you're unconscious of. But they all involve changes in the environment, right? When you feel cold, that was a drop in temperature in the environment. When you see an object, that was a change in the electromagnetic radiation light that hit your eye. When you smell something, those are new particles, new molecules that are in the air. Um, we often describe senses in terms of the stimuli that they respond to. Pain responds to uh, noxious chemicals released during tissue damage. So all of that sensory information feeds into the central nervous system where it is integrated, right? So integration is essentially decision making in a sense, or complex form of integration would be thinking, but there's also very simple forms of integration. When you do integration, basically, um, you know the central nervous system makes a decision on how to respond to sensory input. So some of these happen, subconsciously, very rapidly, and don't even involve the brain. Those would be things like spinal reflexes. You touch a pain, a hot object, and you pull your hand away before you feel the pain. That was integration that occurred in the spinal cord. Um, Integration could be a lot of light is hitting the retina, the photosensitive portion of your eye, and your brain decides that your pupil needs to constrict to let less light in. That's another reflex. Um, integration could be higher level though. It could be like what you're doing now, where you're taking the you know the sound waves, which are vibrations, variations in pressure in the air as they hit their ear. Your brain is interpreting those as uh, words, and you're giving word meaning to those words. You're deciding which words are important and which ones to memorize, and maybe which ones you want to write down. So once the central nervous system has decided how to respond to sensory input, you have to communicate that response to tissues that can have an effect on the environment. We call these tissues that have effects on the environment, we call these effectors. Um, and communication with effectors, that is the motor function, right? So the response is communicated with effectors. So what are the effectors? Well, your conscious effectors would be skeletal muscle, or we call that your voluntary. And then you have several involuntary effectors, which would include cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. Two words that you'll see. Afferents means toward a central location. So, afferent information flow is sensory information. You're going from the periphery to the central nervous system. Another word that will be helpful is efferent. Efferent means away from a central location. E for exit, exiting a central location. Motor information is efferent. These two words you'll see again in AMP2 to describe other things that flow into or out of a central location. So with those functions in mind, we could talk about the way that the nervous system is organized. Your book actually has a graphic on this. It's on the next slide. This is kind of how I think about it. It's similar to how the book outlines it. But basically, you have the nervous system. Basically, any nervous tissue is part of the nervous system. Now, you can divide the nervous system up into the central nervous system or the peripheral referral nervous system. I'll abbreviate nervous system. And basically, that division is made on the basis of function. The central nervous system, that would be your integrative centers. So all the integration asterisks happens in the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system, this is the motor and sensory function, either communicating between receptors and central nervous system or between central nervous system and effectors. So the central nervous system, of course, has two parts. There is the brain and the spinal cord. We will study these. The brain in chapter 14 and the spinal cord in chapter 13. So there's different ways to divide up the peripheral nervous system. You can basically divide it up either based on function, motor versus sensory. That's kind of how your book does it on the next slide. Or you can do it versus the conscious versus unconscious. That is to say, the somatic versus autonomic. Now, I think to stay more consistent with the next slide, I will divide it up into a sensory component and a motor component. I was actually attempting to record this the other day, and I did it based on conscious and unconscious, and I didn't like the results as much. All right, so sensory information, remember, this is going from the sensory receptors that detect changes in the environment and, carry that information into the central nervous system. And you have an autonomic component of that. This would be the unconscious. You are not aware, for example, of changes in your blood pressure. That doesn't reach your consciousness because that is an autonomic sense. You are unaware of the carbon dioxide levels in your blood because that is not a conscious sensation. So you've got the autonomic, and then let's call this the conscious. I don't want to use the word somatic because, in terms of sensation, somatic has a specific meaning. So, when it comes to your conscious sensations, you have the somatic and or general senses, and you have the special senses. And the division here kind of is based a little bit on location. Somatic senses are your body senses. That's what the word somatic means. The somatic senses are located throughout the body. The sensory receptors are often embedded in the skin. This would be your tactile sensations, touch, your thermal sensations, hot or cold, your pain sensations, they call that nociception, and something called proprioception. You have sensory receptors in your muscles, joints, and tendons that give you information about where your body is in space, and they call that proprioception. The special senses, um, these are considered special because they involve very complex sensory structures all located in your head, usually often entire organs dedicated to the sense. They have special areas in the brain. They have dedicated cranial nerves. Uh, they often use a different type of neuron. Somatic senses, we're about to learn about this in the next video, but somatic senses involve unipolar neurons, whereas the special senses involve bipolar neurons. So this is vision, hearing, equilibrium, smell, and taste. And I would argue this is in order of decreasing complexity. Now, the motor, right? We can divide the motor again along the conscious or somatic. This would be communicating with skeletal muscle because this is you have conscious or voluntary. Let's use the word voluntary control. And then you have the autonomic, which autonomic is going to communicate with smooth, cardiac and smooth muscle, various types of glands, both endocrine and exocrine. And these, of course, are involuntary. And there's actually physically two separate sets of neurons that go from the central nervous system out to your cardiac muscle, many of your smooth muscles, some of your glands. There are a set of neurons that belong to the sympathetic uh, division, and then there are those neurons that belong to the parasympathetic. And the functions are often described as either being fight or flight or rest and digest. So sympathetic nervous system activates your tissues that liberate your energy stores, put glucose and oxygen into the blood and get those molecules to your muscles so that you can expend energy. Meanwhile, shutting down anything that is not vital for the next 2 or 3 minutes, like urination, defecation, digestion. The parasympathetic sort of conserves energy, begins to digest your food, and allows you to rebuild those energy stores in case you have to go back into fight or flight mode. So, in some tissues, the sympathetic nervous system will be excitatory, like the heart, which pumps the blood. Others, it will be inhibitory, like, for example, the digestive glands, that it would inhibit them because you don't need to be digesting things if you're trying to run for your life. Um, the autonomic nervous system will be discussed in chapter 15. The somatic sensory division and somatic motor division is covered in chapter 16, and the special senses, one of my favorite chapters, chapter 18. I find it fascinating to learn how your eyes and ears and smell work. A lot of your sensory information comes from there, and it's rather complex and interesting. So that's similar to how your book organizes it. Your book, you know, talks about how the central nervous system. This is sort of where all the integration happens. It receives sensory input. Your book kind of left out the autonomic sensory information, which also feeds into the central nervous system, including the somatic and the special senses. Based on that, there's motor output. Some of that motor output goes through the somatic nervous system to the skeletal muscles. The rest goes to the autonomic nervous system. And from there, it can pass through the sympathetic division or the parasympathetic division to get to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Your book's diagram also includes the enteric nervous system, which controls the smooth muscle and glands of the gastrointestinal tract. We don't really discuss this much within the nervous system. There's a little bit about it in AMP2 in the digestive system. So that's my introduction, and the organization. In the next video, we'll take a look at the structure of neurons and different types of neurons.